It's something that I'm sure many of you will have seen before. Flanked by medal-heavy generals and veterans of conflicts past, Vladimir Putin sits impassively in Moscow's Red Square as the annual Victory Day parade unfolds in front of him. Commemorating the Soviet Union's triumph in World War II over Nazi Germany, it also serves as a very public display of Russia's current military might. Yet this year, for all that the rhetoric was as belligerent as usual, perhaps even more so in fact, the parade itself has been significantly smaller. The Russians, well, they cite security concerns as the reason. A little less than a week ago, a drone attack struck the Kremlin. There was footage released pretty soon after which showed a device detonating, or perhaps being blown up, above the walls of the fortified Russian complex. The Russians say it was a Ukrainian attempt to assassinate Vladimir Putin.
Уважаемые граждане России, дорогие ветераны, товарищи солдаты и матросы, сержанты и старшины.
Ukraine says it was most likely a false flag and denies its involvement. At the time of recording, the war that Russia assumed it would win in a handful of days has been going for 440 of them. So just how much power is Vladimir Putin actually projecting? I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily. Well, I am in the studio with our International Affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, and our military analyst, Professor Michael Clark. Gents, good to see you both. And I suppose we really need to start with a reminder of exactly what this day commemorates. Dominic.
So this is Victory Day. It is the day when Russians remember the victory in what they call the Great Patriotic War, the Second World War as we call it, when the Russians, a huge cost and huge sacrifice, did eventually defeat the Nazis and expel them from Russia. And for Vladimir Putin, it's a day where you emphasize the fact that the Russians not just fought Germany back in the 40s, but also, in his mind, is fighting the West now. And that's in line with what Russian propaganda has been doing as well, which is kind of conflating the war now with the war back then. You may wonder how that happens. And the argument made by his regime is that effectively Britain and America and the West was kind of in league with the Nazis. And therefore, just as Russia fought Napoleon in the 19th century and has fought the West, conflating Germany and Britain and America in the 40s, it is fighting the West again. So effectively, Putin's kind of hijacked what was very much a day all about celebrating the victory against Germany alone.
I mean, Michael, didn't the Brits used to send along representatives to Victory Day? And we fought alongside them, I thought.
Absolutely, yes. Well, I mean, we celebrated that as allies. I mean, Britain and America, France, Poland would have representatives there, sometimes very high-level representatives, in order to emphasise the fact that we were partners. Putin became Prime Minister in 1999, so he's already been in power for 24 years. And as his power has gone on, these Victory Day celebrations have become more important to him because he takes pride in Russia's military prowess. He wants to say to the Russian people, we've always got cash and the Russian economy will always be strong because we're an energy economy and we've got our military. And as his policies have become more aggressive over the years in international affairs, so his military demonstrations become more important to him.
Yeah, I wonder, though, I mean, how strong a message is he sending to the Russian people at a time when, by my ill-educated estimation, this was a scaled-down victory parade by any measure?
It was scaled down. Russians, ordinary Muscovites, couldn't actually get to see it, which is astonishing because it's a very long parade route. They spent all day, I think, trying to get to see it. And Muscovites were saying to them, how do we get to see this parade, which is a big change from the past. It was cancelled in 22 cities, and the Immortal Regiment parade was cancelled as well across Russia. And that is when Russians come out on the streets with big photos they hold up of their loved ones, their relatives, their ancestors who died in the Second World War. I think the fear for the government was they might have been coming out en masse with photographs.
There would have been a sea of photographs of Russian military personnel that had been lost, wouldn't there?
Almost certainly. And what this government's been very successful at and gone to great lengths to do is to try and mask the extent of casualties. In a country as vast as Russia, you can do that because the body bags are going home to quite often sort of villages sparsely, sort of not that close to each other in the east, and not as many from those sort of metropolitan centres like St. Petersburg and Moscow. So, yeah, I think a lot of photographs of Russian soldiers who've died in this war, I think, would have been alarming to Russians and certainly not what the government would have wanted to see.
We were settling in this morning for a 2-hour event. We all got ourselves settled in the studio thinking, OK, well, this will be 8 till 10.
You've got your coffee, you've got your biscuits.
Absolutely.
You're ready to go.
We've been to the gents first and all that. We've done all the right things that professional broadcasters should do. And it was all over in 45 minutes. I mean, my coffee was still warm. And it was the marches, the speech by Putin, which is pretty short, and then a little bit of military hardware. And first of all, there was the heritage stuff, the T-34 tank leading at the iconic tank of the Second World War.
It was the only tank I think I saw.
It was the only one that I saw. And then there was some armoured personnel vehicles, again, heritage vehicles more than anything else. Then some nuclear stuff, the big intercontinental missiles. I think it was probably the Samat missile, the big, the Satan missile, as they call it, the biggest one that Putin keeps boasting about. There was a few of those, and that was it. We were waiting for the armoured vehicles, the tanks, all the new material, all the high-tech stuff that normally goes past. Nothing. And in 45 minutes, it was all over.
Is this because all of that kit and equipment is being used elsewhere?
No.
Obviously.
I mean, they can always pull equipment together. That's the point. You need half a dozen of them or 10 or 15 of them. I mean, it's not a parade of hundreds and hundreds of tanks, but it's a parade of different types of things. And those of us who take an interest in these affairs are always looking for what's the new stuff, what we might normally have expected, these, the most modern tanks. But there was nothing. And I think the reason for that is not because they don't have them, but because I think Putin didn't want to emphasise that side of it. And I think they just wanted this parade and the whole event to be over quite quickly to reduce the hostages to fortune of something going wrong or some incident happening or something that would undermine the whole message of the day. That would be my own estimate.
Well, that has to be said. They do have a lot less tanks, don't they? A lot fewer. And actually, I was there a year ago, and there were a lot fewer tanks there because they had already lost a lot. And since then, they've lost how many tanks? What? 1,500, 2,000 tanks?
Yeah, at least, that are certifiably lost by visual identification, and actually it's climbing now towards over 2,000.
Of course, we also heard from Vladimir Putin himself. And speaking not that far, of course, from where the Russians claim Ukraine launched a drone strike against the very heart of the Russian kind of political apparatus. I mean, listening to Putin himself, what did we learn? There was an awful lot of quite concerning rhetoric being used.
There was. It was sort of classic Putin, but very short, not like the speech he gave in February when he basically told the Russians that this war is something that they were going to have to get used to, kind of normalising a war. It would be going on in the background he sort of hinted at for years to come. This is more of a sort of short rant about the West, about the globalist elites, he says, that have taken over and hijacked the West, responsible for the Russophobia that's persecuting Russia, a West that is destroying family values, so a little bit about that. But he's painting a picture of the West being mad, bad and dangerous to Russia, says that it's propagating a system of violence and robbing others and using terrorism. But the heart of the speech, or the most punchy and frankly the maddest sounding bits, when he said the West is trying to cancel the outcome of the Second World War.
Sorry, what?
So at an event where, as we were saying, traditionally we have seen Western leaders. John Major went to the Victory Day parade in 1995. We now have the Russian leaders saying that the West is trying to cancel the outcome of the Second World War. And that's basically explained by this idea, as I was saying, that Putin is peddling, which is that Russia is now alone standing up, that the heir to the values and the world order that the Second World War fought for and that so many Russian soldiers died protecting. Russia alone is standing up against this mad, bad West that is a threat to that. It sounds insane, but within the frame of reference that he's been propagating and his propaganda as well, it makes sense to him and he may well believe it himself.
Michael?
Yes, Russia is a revisionist power. So is China. I mean, there are 4 big powers in the world that make the political weather for everybody else. America, China, Russia and India. And 2 of those 4, China and Russia, are explicitly revisionist, which is to say that they're trying to change the rules of world politics, that they're actually trying to remake the rules of world politics. Now, we haven't seen revisionist powers in the world since the Axis powers of the 1930s. The fascist powers were revisionist because they wanted to change the rules that had emerged at the end of the First World War. And that's exactly the message, as Dominic says, of Russia now. They're saying that, first of all, that the Second World War was not the way the rest of the world sees it. The Second World War was Russia standing up to the fascists who were somehow driven, created by the West. And increasingly, he sees himself performing this role of righting the wrongs of history in a way that will put him on the same scale as Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, Joseph Stalin, and Vladimir Putin.
Now, for a nation that is not famed for its tolerance of dissent, there has been much more than you might expect. Presenters on Russian state TV, well, they've been critical of the strategy in Ukraine. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the paramilitary Wagner group, which has been providing Russia with much of its cannon fodder, well, he's been pointedly accusing decision makers of treason for not providing his men with sufficient ammunition. Well, let's return to our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, and security and defence analyst, Professor Michael Clark. Dom, I mean, you have to wonder just how effective a projection of power the Victory Day parade was, given such levels of dissent.
Yeah, you have. But I think probably Putin sees that as kind of that is acceptable in the sense of in the court of the modern day Tsar that he is, to a certain extent, as long as he seems to feel comfortably in control. What's clever about Putin is that, you know, for all his faults, he understands the Russian psyche. He understands he's tapping into a deep well of paranoia that Russians have always had for geographical reasons, that very exposed western border that Napoleon and the Nazis trampled and violated, and for historical geographical reasons that they have this paranoia. But there's a reason why Putin has banged on about the victory over the Nazis throughout his time in office, and why this day is so important to him. And arguably that's because Russia is such a vast, diverse country. There's not much that holds it together apart from that memory of that great victory. Because almost every Russian family will have a relative whose photo they can hold, whose memory of whose sacrifice they are proud of.
Yeah, there were some very impressive collections of medals on display at the Victory Day parade on some of the older attendees. There's clearly a long and proud tradition of a military tradition in this country.
Right, and Russia is huge. It doesn't have any isms to believe in anymore. It doesn't have any strong leaders. Putin would like to be seen as a strong leader, but he's not a Stalin or a Lenin. It doesn't have a rule of law. It doesn't have a system of government, really. It's run by basically a kleptocratic cabal. And so the one thing I think this is a persuasive argument that ties Russians together is that memory of the victory over the Nazis, which is why Putin has made a lot of his claim that Ukraine is run by Nazis when it obviously isn't. It's run by a Jewish man whose family were wiped out, along with 6 million Jews and 27-odd million Soviets by the Nazi government. But that hasn't stopped Putin making this claim that Ukraine is run by Nazis. And I think it's for this deep sort of historical reason that does chime with many Russians. And I think the hope is that with this parade, he's tapping into that every year. But with every year, it's looking weaker. And if this is a sequel to the Great Patriotic War, when he's celebrating a victory, the question obviously in the minds of Russians is, when is victory coming in this sequel? Clearly not anytime soon.
The prevailing ism in Russia is cynicism. That's it. That's the ism. Pessimism or cynicism. That's the ism. Yeah. And remember, I mean, as Dominic says, I mean, Russia is an internal empire. The Russian Federation itself is an empire. And the point about empires is that they're either contracting or expanding. And one of the things that really bothers the Russians deep down in the psyche is that the Russian Empire itself, the Federation of Russia, may collapse.
And I want to return to that drone strike that took place. Are we any closer to understanding the truth of what happened there? I mean, Ukrainians are claiming it to be a false flag.
Well, I mean, it's created a huge amount of conspiracy theories and a whole welter of different stories and claims and counterclaims. I think, you know, if it was the Russians doing it as a false flag operation, I mean, the argument goes that to continue enslaving the Russian people, Hermann Goering said in Nuremberg, to enslave a people, you just need to scare them. To keep this going, the Russian government needs to keep coming up with new ways of scaring Russian people. And whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. This drone flew over St. Basil's Cathedral, Red Square, the Lenin Mausoleum, the walls of the Kremlin, and into the Kremlin itself. So about 4 or 5 icons there. And on the one hand, it projects an image of weakness. But I think if you're watching at home, if you're Russian, it makes you worried. It makes you feel alarmed. And if you need an excuse to cancel 22 Victory Day parades around the country and to ban the Immortal Regiment parades, then that's one way of doing it. On the other hand, there are no shortage of security threats and reasons to be worried about security, attacks on oil refineries and the rest of it across Russia. I think you can argue either way. If it was the Ukrainians, it was an extraordinary feat to pull off because that is a very protected building.
And I think if Ukraine was behind this officially in some way, if Kiev planned this, I think it was extraordinarily stupid of them because there was nothing to gain materially from this and an enormous amount to lose. Because, if Ukraine looks as if it's launching strategically effective attacks on Russia itself, then it will lose Western support and then it loses the war. Simple as that.
And what of the counteroffensive, the Ukrainian counteroffensive that we have been told has been coming for quite some time? Do we know where? Do we know when? Do we know what it's going to look like?
Certainly not. And nor should we.
Exactly.
Nor should we. What we do know is that they've created what look like 12 new brigades of about, say, 60,000 new troops, which is not that many, and that they've got at least 3 probably quite heavily armoured brigades amongst that, and then they've got another 4 or 6 veteran brigades to which they've given some of the new equipment. But any military professional will tell you, looking at force to space ratios, as they say, that gives you a front that you could cut through anything on a front of maybe 40 or 50 kilometres at most. But that's across a front of almost 1,000 kilometres. So of 1,000 kilometres fighting front, which 50 kilometres are you going to cut through? And to do what? And as some people say, some of the Ukrainians are incredibly confident about this and they're very upbeat. The Russians will throw more people at it, they'll throw more troops, more equipment at it, and it will just close around you. But bottom line for me is if the Ukrainians can threaten Crimea, not take Crimea, if they can threaten Crimea credibly, then they'll come out of this ahead in terms of pushing the Russians towards some sort of more meaningful ceasefire.
And the worry in the West, I think, is if they do threaten Crimea, then does that then threaten Putin enough to do something extreme? That's certainly a preoccupation that's been bothering people like Emmanuel Macron. An argument's been made, I think, in Washington as well. And that's one reason why the West hasn't given, I think, Ukraine as full a support militarily as they might have. But I think as this war drags on, I think there's a greater enthusiasm. All that resistance is ebbing away. Do you think, Michael?
Yes, the danger is that unless the Ukrainians are seen to be decisive, unless they can change the balance on the battlefield and so on, not just do well, but seem to be decisive, so that it looks as if they could throw the Russians out, say, by this time next year or 18 months at the most. If they can create that expectation in the West, then the West will stick with it.
Well, isn't that the point? And it's a question that the three of us have returned to countless times over the past 12 months, is what does victory look like to Ukraine?
Actually, I think victory to Ukraine and to the West would be throwing the Russians out of the territories they've taken since February 22. If you could do that, you could say, right, we've reversed the invasion, we've reversed this imperialist adventure. Any more than that, it's a bonus. And the Ukrainians will say, well, we're going for everything. They've got to say that. But in reality, this is like turning back Saddam Hussein in 1991. He invaded Kuwait. The world united, threw him out of Kuwait and said, right, that's it. We've reversed the decision. And what happens to Saddam now is not our problem. If we could reverse this invasion so that Putin has failed, he's paid a heavy price for it, what now happens in Russia is their problem, not ours. That would look like success to me, and I think to a lot of politicians in the West.
But if you talk to Ukrainians, victory for them is the Russians being thrown out of all territory, so
Correct.
Crimea as well. And the question is, will they settle for a compromise? And I think the Ukrainians you talk to when you go there, ultimately, what they want is for this never to happen again. So Russia has to be beaten resoundingly and decisively so they never have a base from which to launch this kind of operation again. So effectively, for most Ukrainians, that does mean retaking Crimea. Although if I think they can be reassured that it will never happen again, then they may settle for the Russians hanging on to Crimea.
OK, so here is the dangerous status quo, which we might contemplate. The Ukrainians throw the Russians out of everything they've taken since 22. They want to go further, but we say, no, you're not going further. We'll put the Donbass, the two breakaway republics and Crimea into an international negotiation, which will run for 30 years, come up with nothing. It doesn't matter. It takes it off the table for a while. And meanwhile, you will come into NATO with these new boundaries, and the Russians won't dare threaten these new NATO boundaries. Now, that would, on paper, work, but my goodness, that would be dangerous. That would be high-stakes NATO politics.
I think the only thing that is certain is that we three will meet again soon and discuss these topics. Michael,
doubt.
Dominic, good to see you.
Thank you.
My thanks to Dominic Waghorn, Michael Clark, and of course to you for listening to the Sky News Daily with me, Neil Patterson. This edition was produced by Soila Aparicio. Our editor is Philly Beaumont.